The Dark Sanctuary, written and read by Christopher Halton. I was, of course, deeply saddened to be informed of the loss of my uncle, Marmaduke de Frere, by his solicitors, Jeffreys and Company of Norwich, Norfolk, as he was my last living relative. My parents had been killed many years earlier while engaged in missionary work in India, and I had no siblings. It would be fair to say that my contact with my late family had been scant. I was raised in England by my nanny, Mrs. Bosanquet, and spent my formative years at various boarding schools before receiving a fellowship at Cambridge, where I earned a degree in history. I was, as a consequence, a lonely child with little sense of my own family's identity. Uncle Marmaduke was my father's elder brother, and he lived on the small family estate near Cromer. That, in truth, was all I knew of him. I had been, in many respects, a lifelong orphan, and the telegram sent by Mr. Jeffreys Sr. was to change all of that. It was in the spring of 1895 that I attended the offices of the solicitors and learned that Marmaduke had bequeathed to me his Somerfield estate, together with £1,000 worth of shares and annuities. The sole caveat, as read aloud by Mr. Jeffreys, was that I was to reside at Somerfield Hall, failing which the will would be voided and the estate passed to a nominated charity. Having lived alone in a small detached cottage near Hunstanton, I readily agreed. Mr. Jeffreys duly made arrangements for my removal there in April of that year, while my previous home was let. As a cautionary note to this account, I should explain that I had never met my uncle, nor had I ever visited the family estate, which had been in our possession since the end of the English Civil War. Thus, with some apprehension as to what I might discover, I arrived on a typically wet and overcast afternoon. I was greeted by an elderly butler, who extended an umbrella to me as I stepped down from the brougham carriage that had conveyed me from Cromer railway station. He ushered me into the rather gloomy 17th century timber-framed and brick hall, which contained 5 bedchambers. With a polite smile, the butler introduced himself as Thompson, who had been in Marmaduke's service for 50 years. Though in his 70s, he was a sprightly man, dressed in a black long-tailed coat and trousers, with a white wing-collared shirt and tie. Clean, neat, and orderly in appearance, he escorted me through the property, which appeared to be in a good state of preservation beneath the fitted gas lights that illuminated the halls and rooms. Under his supervision were his wife Bridget, who served as cook and housekeeper, together with 2 young footmen and 3 young maids drawn from the locality. All the staff were introduced to me and appeared genuinely pleased that another de Frere had taken up residence. I was comforted to find a well-stocked library, which would serve admirably as my study, and a dining room ample enough to seat 8 guests at a handsome Regency-era mahogany table, its legs carved into hairy-pawed feet. Upon the walls hung portraits of my ancestors, who seemed to peer down at me with a faint suspicion, or so I imagined. The familial likeness was striking. Indeed, I could easily picture myself among them, for we shared many features. The sole absence was my uncle's portrait, which, given the circumstances, struck me as rather odd. After the tour was concluded, my possessions were unpacked and my clothing arranged in the master bedchamber. Over the following days the house appeared warmer and far more inviting during the sunnier intervals, and I was forced to admit that the property was beginning to grow upon me. Adjacent to the hall lay a tract of woodland that extended down to the banks of a stream flowing through the estate. Largely overgrown and encumbered by several trees that had fallen naturally over the years, I engaged several local woodsmen from the nearby village to clear the scrub and cut and store the timber for winter fuel. I intended to manage the estate with a degree of self-sufficiency in heating, rather than relying upon coal, which was the preferred medium for many. After a week or so the work was completed, and I decided to explore the cleared land on horseback. I was surprised to discover deep within the woods the standing walls of a finely constructed medieval ruin of flint and limestone, which upon closer examination appeared to comprise the nave and part of the chancel of a church. Further inspection revealed what I took to be graves, marked by small rectangular mounds of considerable antiquity. The ruins were far larger than those of a typical estate church, which would ordinarily have amounted to little more than a modest chapel, and both the flintwork and surviving stonework were of a notably high quality. This had clearly been a building of some status, and yet it had lain forgotten until the recent clearing of scrub and fallen timber. One feature in particular drew my attention: a large stone altar that appeared entirely undamaged. 2 deep grooves had been carved widthwise at either end of its upper surface, and upon the base wall were incised the Latin words Domus Pacitur Animis. I noticed it almost by accident, for the altar itself was half shrouded by fallen masonry and creeping ivy, and the light that filtered through the broken walls fell unevenly upon it. What first arrested my attention, however, was not the inscription, but the carving beneath it, cut far deeper into the stone base, as though the hand that made it had intended it to endure long after all else had been worn away. It depicted a serpent, thick-bodied and crudely rendered, coiled upon itself in the act of devouring its own tail. Yet the circle was incomplete. A narrow gap remained, too precise to be the result of damage or decay, and I found myself convinced that it had been left so by deliberate design. The creature's jaws hovered eternally a fraction short of their goal, denying the image any sense of closure or renewal. At the centre of the carving there was nothing, and yet it was this absence that troubled me most. There was no cross, no sigil, no emblem of redemption or sanctuary. Only a shallow hollow, darker than the surrounding stone, its surface worn smooth in a manner that could not reasonably be attributed to weather alone. Against my better judgment, I reached out and placed my fingers within it. The stone was cold, unnaturally so, and polished to a softness that suggested repeated contact over a great span of years. I withdrew my hand at once, struck by the peculiar and wholly irrational sensation that the depression had not been shaped merely to receive something, but to retain it, and that whatever had once rested there had not been removed so much as claimed. In its ruined and desolate state, the altar no longer resembled a place of worship. It seemed instead an instrument, patient, expectant, and unfinished. For some moments thereafter, I could not rid myself of the impression that the broken circle awaited its completion, and that the void at its centre had been fashioned with a specific purpose in mind, one that had not yet been fulfilled. I made several sketches of the altar and of the most notable architectural features before returning to the hall to conduct further research in the library. From 17th century antiquarian volumes, I discovered that there had once been a small settlement known as Somerfield Regis, built around a former chapter house belonging to a group of Black Friars who styled themselves Fratres Atrati. According to these accounts, they were former Dominicans who had broken with the church in the late 12th or early 13th century, during a period of intense ecclesiastical anxiety concerning heresy. Official church records were fragmentary, but scattered marginal notes described how the friars continued to operate within consecrated ground and held the belief that salvation was cyclical rather than redemptive. Little, if anything, was recorded of their practices. The order was said to have been extinguished by the Black Death in 1350, along with the village itself, of which nothing now remained. By all descriptions, the church ruins I had discovered appeared to be the sole surviving remnants. Other accounts claimed that the site was cursed and haunted by road monks, that screams and lights were sometimes seen or heard on certain nights. As a result, no one dared approach the ruins, and in time the land was reclaimed entirely by nature. The books in question were the work of Desmond Margrave, whose family held Somerfield until the Civil War. Following their support for the Royalist cause, they were killed by parliamentarian forces during a brief skirmish, a fact I already knew. What I had not realised was that these accounts, written by a former member of that family, had survived at all. The Latin phrase domus pacitur animis was unfamiliar to me and raised more questions than it answered. Rendered into English, it translates as "the house is fed by souls." The meaning baffled me entirely, particularly in the context in which the words had been carved, and I was unable to reconcile them with any orthodox interpretation. I therefore set the matter aside, choosing instead to turn my attention to more immediate concerns, namely the management of the estate, which comprised little more than 50 acres of woodland and farmland. A few weeks later I invited the Somerfield vicar, the Right Reverend Fortescue Hampton, to luncheon at the Hall. A man in his early 60s, he had served the parish for almost 30 years, and was admired and respected across all social classes as a reasoned and balanced man of God. A portly gentleman with a fondness for good food and drink, he was exceedingly convivial. He smoked a long-stemmed clay pipe which he paused to relight at intervals as he regaled me with anecdotes concerning my family and the district at large. After several glasses of port, he turned the conversation to the ruins in the woodland. "You know," he said, "the locals never go into those woods at night. They claim them to be haunted by black-clad friars. In fact, even the poachers won't set foot in there because of it." He leaned back in his chair, warming to the tale. "About 100 years ago, so the story goes, some unwary soul entered the woods one night on a dare, and his body was found the next morning upon the altar, his heart torn clean out." At this, his face broke into a broad grin, and he let out a booming laugh, punctuating it with a deep puff from his pipe. "I hear you had the woods cleared using local labour," he continued. "You're a fortunate man indeed. When I first came here, no one would go near the place, not even by day, so you've done very well for yourself." I told him of my intention to restore the estate to profitability, chiefly through grazing. I admitted that I could not understand why my late uncle had allowed the land to remain so neglected. "He rarely left the hall, that I know," the good Reverend replied, "and in fact in all these years this is the first time I've ever set foot inside it." He glanced about approvingly. "I'm jolly glad that I have too. It's a very handsome house." He paused to refill and relight his pipe, then rose unsteadily to his feet. "Well," he said, "my thanks for the food and the company. I trust I shall be seeing more of you before long." With that, the somewhat inebriated vicar made his way outside to his gig, where the driver, assisted by my staff, managed to seat him safely aboard. Then, with a crack of the whip, horse and gig rattled off down the drive and disappeared into the distance. My meeting with Hampton had raised questions about the alleged human sacrifice, and in doing so had recalled a story my mother once told me, that my uncle had kept a relic he had discovered many years earlier when, as a young man, he had ventured into the woods. I therefore resolved to examine his personal effects, which were curiously stored in a wall safe concealed within the library. Locating the appropriate key among those kept in the hall proved a task in itself, but eventually a large iron key slid neatly into the escutcheon of the safe. With some effort I turned it, the lock clicked and the door groaned open upon its hinges. Inside were several neatly tied bundles of house documents and a single object set apart from them, a brass crucifix suspended from a neck chain and hung inverted. An accompanying note in my uncle's hand stated that he had found it by sliding aside a stone panel at the flank of the altar, and that it dated from the time of the Black Death. The crucifix was small, its surface worn smooth by repeated handling. It did not strike me at once as profane. Indeed, I recalled some half-remembered explanation concerning St. Peter and the manner of his martyrdom. Yet the longer I regarded it, the less it suggested humility, and the more it appeared an emblem of surrender, of something deliberately turned away from its proper order. I replaced the remaining documents, which appeared to be of little consequence, and relocked the safe, retaining the note and the crucifix for further investigation. The cross itself was little more than 2 inches in length, and upon the obverse was engraved a short Latin phrase, Non redimit sed continet. It does not redeem, but contain. Puzzled by what seemed less an explanation than a clue, I took both items to my bedchamber and laid them upon the bedside cabinet, intending to examine them more closely in the morning. During the night I was awakened by whispering voices in the room, speaking in Latin. At first I was unsure whether I was still dreaming, but as my eyes adjusted, I became aware of a dark hooded figure standing at the foot of the bed. It turned towards me and in an instant rushed forward as I lay stricken with terror, unable to move or cry out. I drew the bedclothes over my face and was immediately assaulted by a stench of corruption. The odour of rotten flesh mingled with the damp, loamy scent of freshly disturbed forest earth. My heart pounded so violently that I thought it must surely betray me, and I waited, scarcely breathing, for the weight of the thing to descend upon me. Instead there came birdsong, sudden and unmistakable, and a shaft of bright morning light fell across the bed. I threw back the covers and found myself alone, my chamber filled with nothing more than the sounds of dawn. I breathed a long sigh of relief, persuading myself that it had been no more than a nightmare, or so I believed. After breakfast I returned to the library to examine the crucifix more thoroughly. Seated at the reading table, I placed the object upon the desk before me, arranging my papers as though it were no more than another antiquarian curiosity. It was then that Thompson entered, bearing a pot of tea together with a cup, a saucer, and milk upon a salver. He had begun to speak when his gaze fell upon the crucifix lying plainly in view. At once he faltered, set the tray hurriedly upon a side table, and turned as if to withdraw from the room altogether. I stopped him. "Is something amiss, Thompson?" He turned back slowly, his face noticeably pale, and pointed towards the crucifix. "Master Marmaduke owned that, sir," he said. "And it changed him, not for the better, if you'll pardon my saying so. I believe it came from the old ruins." I invited him to sit, though he did so reluctantly, and replied, "It is interesting you should mention the ruins, Thompson. I am conducting some historical research, and as a local man, your observations may prove of value. What can you tell me of the place?" He hesitated, clearly uneasy. "Well, sir," he said at last, "my parents told me there was a great fire. The friars, the church, and the village were all destroyed. Why, I couldn't rightly say, but that crucifix," he nodded again towards it, "that was their sign, and I believe they were evil men." Before I could question him further, he excused himself and left the room with evident haste. I sat for some time considering his words. If what he said was true, then it had not been the plague that brought an end to the friars. The question then was not merely why they had perished, but who had seen fit to destroy them, and by fire. Thompson's abrupt departure left the room oddly diminished, as though some essential warmth had been withdrawn with him. I remained seated for several minutes, the crucifix still lying upon the desk between my papers, unwilling to touch it again just yet. What troubled me most was not his assertion that the friars had been evil men. Such judgments are easily made in retrospect, but his certainty. It was not the tone of superstition, nor even of inherited fear, but something closer to conviction. He spoke not as one repeating a story, but as one recalling a warning that had been given and never rescinded. When at last I rang for the tea to be refreshed, Thompson did not return. Instead, one of the footmen appeared, pale and apologetic, explaining that the butler had been taken suddenly unwell. I then chose to speak with him, a young man in his early 20s named West, and asked him about my predecessor's portrait. I should add that I did not know whether such an oil had ever been commissioned, but thought it prudent to test the household in this small matter. It would, after all, have been unusual for there to have been none. I was curious to see whether anyone might prevaricate. My gambit appeared to succeed. After a moment's thought, he replied, "I believe it was taken down and put in the attic, sir. I think I remember seeing it, or so I thought. But that was some 5 years ago, and my memory is not what it once was." I thanked him and dismissed him, smiling inwardly as he left. Thompson, I was now certain, knew far more than he was prepared to reveal, and the sudden appearance of the crucifix had unsettled him profoundly. Whether it had merely revived old fears or stirred something darker and more deeply rooted, I could not yet say, but its effect upon him had been unmistakable. I continued my research into the documents, and in a final, much-damaged account, written in a different hand and without attribution, I found a reference that troubled me more than any other. It made no mention of plague nor of death by illness at all, but spoke instead of purification. The friars, it claimed, had been shut within their own sanctuary, and fire had been brought to the place, not in wrath but in necessity. The wording was careful, almost defensive, and concluded with the assurance that what followed was ended so far as mortal means allow. The phrasing struck me at once, not for what it declared, but for what it conspicuously avoided stating. I later returned to the ruined church. Its atmosphere was markedly altered from my previous visit. The surrounding trees now appeared dark and watchful, encircling the site like sentinels guarding an unholy sanctuary whose secrets were yet to be fully disclosed. As I moved among them, I was oppressed by the uneasy conviction that something had attached itself to me, pacing my every step, though I neither heard nor saw it plainly. At the altar I located the concealed stone panel, which slid aside when pressure was applied at its edge. Within there was nothing save dust-laden cobwebs and the dried remains of insects, their brittle forms trembling upon the threads as a faint current of air passed through the cavity. Yet the interior surfaces of this recess told a different story. The stone towards the opening was thickly blackened with soot, its concealment having preserved it from the bleaching effects of time and weather. In that moment, Thompson's account and the unverified document assumed the weight of truth rather than legend. Fire had indeed been brought deliberately to this place, and with purpose. As I examined the evidence more closely, a sudden chill passed across my back, and I became aware, quite distinctly, of a dark movement at the edge of my vision, as though a shadow had slipped past me where no shadow ought to have been. When I turned, there was nothing. Despite this, I left the ruins with a perverse sense of satisfaction, convinced that I had at last secured one vital piece of a historical puzzle long neglected. Yet even as I returned to the hall, I was equally sure that the puzzle was far from complete, and that what remained would not yield itself so readily or so harmlessly. Upon my return to the hall, I set about my purpose without delay, taking a lit oil lamp and making my way to the attic via a trapdoor in the upper floor corridor. With West's assistance, we positioned a ladder beneath the open hatch and climbed inside. The space proved far more extensive than I had expected, crowded with discarded and damaged furniture, old trunks, and miscellaneous effects long since abandoned. We moved several empty wooden tea chests aside before I caught the faint glint of gold barely visible in the lamplight. Drawing closer, I uncovered the edge of a gilt picture frame, and with it the long-missing portrait of Marmaduke. In that moment, understanding came to me with sudden, unwelcome clarity. The painting showed my uncle standing in solemn repose, clad in a black robe, its cowl resting on his head. About his neck hung an inverted crucifix upon a chain, unmistakably the very object I had recovered from the wall safe below. There was no mistaking it, nor could I dismiss it as a coincidence. I stood for some time in silence, the lamp trembling slightly in my hand. Was this merely a grotesque affectation, a piece of private humour perhaps indulged in by an eccentric man? Or did it point to something altogether more disturbing, something whose true significance had thus far eluded me, but which was now inexorably beginning to take shape? That evening I had the portrait cleaned and rehung in the library, where its absence had long been conspicuous. The frame sat comfortably among the others, as though it had merely been awaiting its return, and the balance of the room seemed, to my eye at least, improved by its presence. I took some care in positioning it. The light was adjusted so that the features were neither lost to shadow nor made unduly prominent, and when I stepped back I was satisfied that it neither intruded nor withdrew. It belonged. I returned to the ruins at dusk, carrying the crucifix wrapped in cloth. The woods were utterly still, and though I knew the path well enough, I had the persistent impression that I was not so much walking as being conducted. The altar stood unchanged, its pale stone already dimming with the failing light. I uncovered the crucifix and held it briefly. It felt neither warm nor cold, but curiously inert, as though it no longer belonged to me at all. I slid open the concealed panel and placed the crucifix within. It fitted precisely. When I withdrew my hand and closed the stone, the join vanished, leaving no trace of disturbance. Almost at once a thin mist gathered about the base of the altar. It thickened steadily, rising not from the ground, but from the stone itself, until the altar was wholly obscured. Within the vapour, darker currents formed and reformed, taking on the vague suggestion of upright shapes, elongated, hooded outlines that seemed to incline towards the altar, though whether they advanced or merely resolved from the shifting air, I could not say. For a brief moment the shapes appeared to move in unison. Each bent forward slightly, not in supplication, but with the measured inclination of those acknowledging a task completed. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and without reverence. The mist spread outwards, softening the ruined walls, dissolving the church into pale outlines, until the place itself seemed less a structure than a memory. Then, slowly, the vapour withdrew. The forms within it faded without movement or sound, and the altar re-emerged exactly as before. Intact, unmarked, complete. The oppressive unease that had accompanied me for weeks was gone. In its place was a deep, unnatural calm. I waited, listening, but nothing followed. There were no voices, no movement, no sign that anything had occurred. Yet I knew, without reflection or doubt, that what had been required had now been restored. The end.